but pick out those moments in the past that we tend to associate with the liberal tradition and interrogate them in ways that I don't think they have adequately been interrogated, and suggest the ways in which illiberalism coincided, predated, entangled liberalism at many points. And whether you're looking at the American Revolution constitutional period, or whether, as you said, we're looking at neoliberals and illiberalism of the 1980s, 90s, and early parts of the 2000s, or the last chapter, which is on specters of race war and replacement, that they involve characters that we would not ordinarily imagine as illiberal.
Absolutely. Back to you, Manisha Sinha. We actually have a question from the audience here, an anonymous attendee who asked a methodological question and sort of said, like, in your research for the rise and fall of the Second Republic, what primary sources or historical evidence did you find most compelling or surprising in shaping your understanding of this pivotal period in American history?
That's a great question. I have taught this period of Reconstruction for a long time. I've taught many books on Reconstruction, including Steve's brilliant book, A Nation Under Our Feet. And what struck me, and this is where I think our work, sort of overlaps a little bit here, is the presence of reactionary authoritarianism in American political history. And you can see this in Reconstruction because it's such a contested project right from the start. I mean, what Steve calls illiberalism, I call reactionary authoritarianism in the South. And the sources that really struck out to me, the ones that I think are most compelling and that I'm familiar with, and most historians are, of course, the Freedmen's Bureau records, especially the records of outrages, as they were known as that time. And then, of course, the 13-volume Joint Committee of Congress that was investigating instances of domestic terrorism in the South. Those two, I think a lot of people refer to it. They refer to certain incidents, but I don't know whether we even mined them sufficiently. There have been many books just on these issues, starting with Alan Trelease and recently with Kidada Williams. But there's so much to be seen there. And what shocked me was the utter barbarism of that kind of political violence. We are not talking about just assassinating people, which happened with African Americans and white Republican allies, but really instances of torture, which led Robert Elliott, the congressman from South Carolina, to say, "Pray, who is the barbarian here?" And I think, as Steve defines illiberalism as, the use of political violence to sort of get your will, and you can really see that as a very apt case study when you look at Reconstruction in the South and the way it's brutally overthrown.
Absolutely. And I mean, I'm going to steer our conversation now, squarely into the Second American Republic and both its rise and especially its fall. I want to unwind it. Sort of to tee up that transition, though, Steve, you have these wonderful chapters that are on sort of the founding and into Jacksonian America. And I wonder if there are any strands that you'd want to pull out that help sort of feed into the conversation we're going to have about the Second American Republic. Any key strands of illiberalism that you think are important to contextualize that conversation?
Well, let me just mention a number of things. One of the things I think we overlook in terms of American political culture is anti-Catholicism, which was very, very powerful and was very much part of the kind of republicanism that was embraced. Along with that is not only, an attachment to monarchy and other forms of hierarchical authority. I was very interested in reading not only the Federalists, but the Anti-Federalists, who are oftentimes seen as advocates of local democracy, which in part they were, and they rejected the Constitution because of their fears about the centralization of power. But in fact, in many cases, they were interested in maintaining local power and the local hierarchies that power involved. And so in some ways, these deeply rooted ideas of cultural homogeneity and certain kind and anti-Catholicism work. I would say one of the things about the Jacksonian period, which I think links up very well with what Manisha was talking about, is, I call the chapter Tocqueville, Lincoln, and the Expulsive 1830s. And to remind readers that Jacksonian democracy was accompanied by and reinforced by the expulsions, not simply of native people, which is best known and which was horrific, but expulsions of Catholics, of Mormons, of abolitionists, of Black people and Black communities, a kind of celebration of these expulsions in many, many different contexts. This was also a period where not only Lincoln warned about the threat of mob violence overtaking the rule of law, but when Tocqueville warned about the descent to tyranny that he saw even in the midst of what he described as a pretty robust democratic culture, and his worries about how the associational components of democratic life could easily veer. I mean, he said he'd never been in a country where there was less independence of mind than there was in the United States of this period. And, politics in general was marked by, especially in cities, but not only, was marked by election day violence, by military cadences in the campaigns leading up to it. We know that state legislatures and Congress often saw weapons being brandished, duels being, challenges. So, the kind of violence that erupts especially horrifically during Reconstruction is embedded in American politics and political culture quite deeply.
Thank you so much for that, Steve Hahn. And, one thing for the audience here is, one of the things Steve's talking about there is Lincoln's Lyceum address, which if you want to read a good excerpt of it, you could check it out at the National Constitution Center's Founders Library, which it remains just an amazing meditation on the politics of the Jacksonian era. Pivoting back to Manisha Sinha, one of the things your book, as I said, one of the most fascinating parts of your book is the back half talking about the collapse of Reconstruction and the slow unwinding of it. But you also do in the front half capture the power, the transformational power of the height of Reconstruction as well. And in particular, the central role that African Americans play in that part of the story. You say, in your book that the aspirations of the enslaved were foundational to the Emancipation Amendment, so the 13th Amendment, and the broader revision of the Constitution that began in 1865. Can you just talk a little bit more about, the role of African Americans in this moment of constitutional creation, of landmark statutes, and then also how that feeds very practically into, our first real massive experiment in multiracial democracy in America?
Yes, so I have an entire section called Grassroots Reconstruction, where I really wanted to see how freed people on the ground are influencing Reconstruction. We normally think of Reconstruction as these amendments and laws that are passed in Washington, which of course it was, but we need to see some of the impetus coming from freed people themselves. So one of the first petitions to impeach Andrew Johnson comes from a group of freed people in Savannah, Georgia, in 1865. And this is even before Congress is passing the Civil Rights Act and the Freedmen's Bureau, trying to renew the Freedmen's Bureau Act and having Johnson veto those two. So freed people are pretty astute in terms of recognizing the lay of the land and understanding that despite all its flaws, an agency like the Freedmen's Bureau can also be remade by them. In the sense of it's not just an agency that is a kind of a representation of Northern visions of Reconstruction, but it is also, of course, a representation of what freed people are demanding, their freedom claims, their insistence on reporting all the terror that is being meted out against them. That was not initially the charge of the Freedmen's Bureau, which was going to just look at oversee the transition from slavery to freedom. And so for me, it was important to look at those actions, even the experiments in land redistribution, which is often portrayed as one of the failures of Reconstruction. The fact that Stevens and other radical Republicans' vision of breaking up the plantation economy in the South doesn't come to pass. But if you look during the Civil War, there are all these experiments with land redistribution through the Freedmen's Bureau, whether it's abandoned or confiscated lands. Now, of course, Johnson reverses quite a bit of those. But I think it was still important for me to look at the vision that Southern Black people had of democracy, not just in terms of personal rights or civil rights and political rights or even land redistribution, but also their vision of social democracy, their notion that the government is responsible for the welfare of its most vulnerable citizens, especially those who had already proved their loyalty to the Union, unlike their former enslavers. So just tracing that process out on the grassroots, even in the question of women's rights, where we do not look at freed women at all, or their struggles, or at the constitutional conventions, Reconstruction constitutional conventions, where many issues of women's rights pop up. That's another source I would recommend. Just, it makes for tedious reading, but just reading the minutes of all those state constitutional conventions can sometimes yield surprising results. And that is, the reason why I wanted to think of Reconstruction as a two-way process. It's not just as we think of emancipation as not just a gift handed to Black people, but we look at the ways in which African Americans enacted their own freedom and push the process for abolition and later on for Black rights forward. And the reason why this is so important, of course, is it's pushing at the boundaries of American democracy and what was understood as the basic precepts of American republicanism. So there's no gainsaying the fact that that moment of achievement is something that we do need to look at. There's a lot of work recently that has said that, that radical Reconstruction was not that radical, that it operated within certain parameters. But from the perspective of freed people, they were conducting their own grassroots experiments in Reconstruction that I think it's important for us to look at, because a lot of those ideas come back up with the populists, with the Knights of Labor, the American Socialists, during the Progressive era, New Deal. These don't die out. So Reconstruction and its discontents is an important idea, I think, for us to think about in terms of its political legacies. One of your questioners was asking about Grant and the enforcement acts in South Carolina to stamp down the Ku Klux Klan. And yes, the Department of Justice is formed in 1870. The enforcement acts, which are now being evoked against political violence, were passed at that point. And I think it's important to trace some of those political legacies, how anti-big government rhetoric, or what we call today political conservatism, that is born during Reconstruction, more expansive notions of government's role in society and economy in terms of correcting disparities. Those ideas are being debated during Reconstruction, and we still live with some of those ideas in terms of our political traditions.
Well, I would just add to that it seems to me that the Reconstruction story reminds us that over the course of American history, those people who have been committed to the most expansive ideas about rights and about democracy have been those who historically have been denied them. And, in some ways, we need to recognize that insofar as we do value the idea of widespread civil and political rights and the aspirations for democracy, they're the ones we have to thank, because they have fought for it not only in the middle of the 19th century and helped bring about our great revolution, but continue to fight for it to the present day.
Thank you for that addition there, Steve. That was a great expansion on what Manisha was saying. Manisha, thank you so much for bringing in Carol Patterson's question in your response there. It was a great one about grant.